Okay, it's loading. Okay, we're officially live. Okay, it's loading. Okay, we're officially live. Okay, it's loading. Uh-oh, I'm gonna have to. I think I'm gonna have to mute the. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I have to mute the YouTube video or else it's gonna play back.
Are we recording? Like, do we have to start something separate to record it?
Hina, I think you're muted.
Oh, it will record to YouTube, I think. I can maybe do a record on my end just to make sure I get saved to my account too, once we start in Zoom. I'm
Perfect.
just gonna say if you all didn't mind maybe changing your names just so, can you do that? Maybe I'm not allowed to change my name. No, you can, okay, just like maybe rename yourself. Oh, yeah, there you go. Just so you're both can see what your name is. Oh, hey, people are here. They can hear us.
Hi. Okay, it's 7. Do you guys want to start? Okay, cool. Well, for people who are watching, welcome to the first Roundtable Mentor event. This is the querying panel, and we have a bunch of great panelists here to talk about all things querying. We're just gonna, I think, start with if everyone on the Zoom could introduce themselves and give a brief sort of summary of your querying journey, like how you landed to the agent that you have now. That would be great. And I'll start at the top left of my screen. So Vishaka, if you want to start. Sorry to put you on the spot.
All good. Um, Taking the plunge. I'm Vishaka, Shriram, and I signed with my agent in May. After, like, my story is one of a lot of perseverance, I think. Um, I I queried. In the end, I think the total number of queries that I sent out before I got my offer was like 80, which isn't that much. I think considering today's background, but like I sent it out in small batches with a lot of editing in between. So it was actually about a year or so, or a year and a half, and almost 2 years that I spent creating the book that finally got me an agent. So yeah, that's my experience.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm from Australia. I'm the acquisitions editor for Evernight Publishing for their adult imprint and for teen, as well for YA. I'm currently agentless. I have had 2 agents in the past and I am seeking a third. My 2 agents are Red Flag Tours. So my first agent came through PitMad back in the old days. And she left her agency and her entire list in the lurch. The agency did try and replace her, but that didn't work out. She was a kid lit agent in a acting talent agency, so they left me with a reference, which was really lovely of them, and wished me well, which is really nice. My second agent turned out to not work out so well either. She didn't read the manuscript at all and sent it out full of errors. I found that out 22 months later and parted ways and sold the manuscript myself. So I am currently seeking other agents for other works, but I'm taking a break for querying at the moment, but I do acquisitions actively on a day-to-day basis, so I can look at it from that point of view as well.
I think Hien is next.
Hi, I'm Hing Wen, and I'm a writer of speculative fiction. I became agented in 2022, so a few years ago, but post, the pandemic and things radically changing, I think, in the querying landscape. I will preface the panel by saying I'm one of the folks who had maybe a unicorn or unique querying experience, but I did query with a project that had a lot of things like they warn you about. So there's a prologue, it's dual timeline, it switches tenses and POVs. So it was a lot of experimental things in one manuscript. So I broke a lot of rules, but I was definitely one of the instances of lightning in the bottle moments, right? With the right agencies at the right time. And I started querying in March of 2022. and then had my first offer a month later, so in April. And the agent I landed with, Caitlin Detweiler, is really wonderful, but she actually wasn't part of my original list. And I had found her because she had done this interview talking about the manuscript she's interested in and how she approaches querying. So if you're struggling to find agents through the kind of typical route, I would recommend looking up interviews or media pieces where they might say a little bit more about their list. And she said something like, I can deal with plot or I can fix plot, but I'm really attracted to voice. And I was like, great, I am all voice, no plot. And that's what I need help with. So I queried her in like a later batch, and she ended up reading in like a week and was very kind of proactive. So I'm someone who benefited from like having the right person who was really passionate at the right time.
I can go next. Hi, my name is Eunice Kim. I've had the unique experience. So I'm actually a two-time Korea trench survivor at this point, but I've had the unique experience querying pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. So when I first started querying, it was from probably like 2016 to 2018, I would say. And when I did a couple of things. So I did curl querying, but I also did DVPIT. I also did PitMed. I actually did DBPIT. I actually don't know how any of us did this back when like the Twitter character limit was still, I think, like 140 characters instead of 280 characters. So yeah, I don't know how any of us did that. And so I did like a number of things, but for my first agent, I actually found her at a writers conference because I had signed up for like a pitch session with her. And so I signed with her probably, I think, probably like fall 2018. We worked together for 2 years, but I actually made the decision to leave her in fall 2020. It was an amicable parting. We just kind of weren't on the same page editorially, which can happen over time. Because one of the hardest things about the agent author relationship is like you don't actually know what the relationship is going to be like until you actually start working for them. So it can be the case, for example, like your career goals can shift. Like you might sign with an agent in which they may not represent like a category that you're interested in branching out and so on. And so when I went back into the trenches, it was a different experience. I was only there, it was also kind of a unicorn experience the second time around. But I think what was helpful was I had a much better idea of what I was looking for in an agent as well too, because I'd worked with one for 2 years. So for my second time around, I think it was from October 2020, and I think I got the first agent offer the second time around at the end of January 2021. And so I got 3 offers for representation. But what ended up also happening at the end of December 2020 was my second agent, she actually left agenting as a profession entirely. I was actually pretty lucky in which I got offered another offer rep from a different agent within the same agency. So I was able to stay with that agency essentially. But sometimes that doesn't always end up being the case. But I was pretty lucky in that aspect. But and I also will say like the querying landscape, it's basically different. Like the difference is basically as different as night or day. Like there have been like a lot of changes. Like for example, off the top of my head, before the pandemic, like the fortunate reality is sometimes you have like agents who will ghost on for requests, but I distinctly remember like that was never a thing that really ever happened. But I have heard that is like a newer thing like post-pandemic because agents have been getting slammed, like we're started to get like slammed with queries because you also had a lot of writers that started writing for the first time during the pandemic as well too. So they received lots and lots of queries. But yeah, that's my experience.
Well, I think that leaves me. I'm Marina or M. Stevenson, and I am also on my second agent. I also queried pre and post pandemic. So I started querying in 2014, and I have queried a total of, I think, technically 6 books. So I got my first agent offer in 2022 on the 5th book I'd written and the 4th book I'd queried. I ended up turning down that offer and querying my next book. I got another agent offer on the next book. So that's book 6 that I wrote and book 5 that I'd queried. I accepted the offer. We went on submission. I ended up leaving that agent in 2023 and querying again with the next book. Although technically that I queried with 2 books because I threw another one out in the trenches at the same time because I was really tired of waiting. So I signed with my current agent in August of 2023. yeah, after just under 2 months of querying, and that book went on submission in last January and got an offer in 48 hours. So that is my journey.
Thanks so much for sharing, everyone, and congrats, Marina. So I think we're just going to jump into the next question, or the first question. So these are ones that we kind of created together just to make sure we were touching on sort of every important aspect of querying, and then we'll then switch into questions that we receive from our Discord and also Twitter. But yeah, so to start off, what do you think is the most important element of a strong query letter? Are there any common mistakes that you think people make? And also, how can writers effectively personalize their queries for agents? So I know that's kind of 3 questions in one. Feel free to tackle any part of it. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it open, and whoever wants to start can just start.
Yeah, I can get started. I have a lot of thoughts about this topic, but also because I worked in the traditional publishing industry, I've literally looked at creative letters like by the thousands essentially at this point. So I think I like want to start with like a brief introduction about career letters, in which the way to think about career letters, not to use job hunting jargon here, but you can really think of it as like the cover letter for your book. And what's important is the career letter, along with your first sample pages, are really important because they're kind of like your first and really only shot that you have to really entice the literary agent and spark their interest. So the idea is for a career letter is you want to tease enough of the story so they feel like they have no choice but to ask for a partial or for a request. One of the most common pitfalls that I see for career letters is the career letter is not the synopsis because the synopsis is entirely separate, in which the synopsis, it's a concise summary that details your entire book. And so one of the most like common pitfalls I see is people when they write the career letter and what's like the pitch section of your book, like they try to pitch the entire book, which is not generally not the purpose. And for me, like from an industry perspective, I feel like the most successful career letters usually have these 3 major elements, which is like the pitch section. Then you have kind of like what I call like the metadata paragraph. So that's like talking about like the age group, the genre, and like any relevant comp titles, and then your bio. And when you first think of your career letter, there kind of is like some important questions you want to keep in mind. But what I recommend, and it also relates to how you think about your book, but basically you also want to try to think of coming up with basically what I call like the thesis statement of your book, in which you think about like, because there are a couple of things a career letter should address. Typically, it should focus on like, introducing your protagonist, generally what the setting is, but also, what does your character kind of ultimately want, and kind of also touching upon like any like overarching themes to your book that you want readers to be aware of. And the idea is for really good career letters, what can happen in the future is some career letters can actually be used as what's called like the pitch letter to editors when you're going out in submission after you've been agented. Or I've seen in some cases, some parts of career letters actually become part of like the Jack like flap copy of a book, essentially. And another common pitfall I would say is you should also do research to make sure your protagonist and your book is being pitched in the right age group. And so typically off the top of my head, for example, like middle grade, that typically involves a protagonist who's like 8 to 12, 13. Young adult is typically ages 14 to 18. Adults is 18 and up. But one of the common mistakes I see is some books being pitched as for young adults, which I think can be a little confusing because like the term itself colloquially, like people will, refer to young adults like in their like early 20s and so on. But from the perspective, like if you're trying to pitch like a YA book with a protagonist who's like 20, 22, 24, that's way too old for basically a young adult. And an agent will probably like make note of that. And it is one of those things in which they're pretty like there isn't really a lot of, if any, flexibility on essentially. And so I would not try to approach it like, oh, maybe like they'll think my book is going to be the exception. In most cases, it unfortunately will not be the case. So those are some of the common pitfalls for query letters I can think of off the top of my head.
Well, I could add on to that a little bit and talk about personalization, unless anyone else wants to go. I guess for generally query letters, before I talk about personalization, I think I added a lot of query letters, and one thing that I tend to notice is being really vague. So like if there are things in your query letter that could apply to any book, like dark family secrets or everything is at stake, or she must decide what to sacrifice before whatever. I would look for those sort of things and take as many of them out and replace them with specifics about your book, because you can, like, if it could apply to any book, any genre, then it really shouldn't be in your query letter. Yeah, and then for personalization, this is partly just my opinion, but I think that most personalization is not needed, because you could spend hours and hours looking through agents' manuscript wish lists and like their interviews and stuff, and then they reject you a day later. So I think the personalizations that do work are things like if you have multiple possible comp titles and one of them is on an agent's wish list, to use that one instead of your other possible ones. If you have something really specific, like they've put out like a hyper-specific tweet that they're looking for something that matches your book, then definitely mention that. If they've liked one of your pitches, or if you've had an actual interaction with them, or if they've requested one of your manuscripts before, then those are all things worth mentioning. But otherwise, I feel like the personalization really doesn't make that much difference. And like just based on the queries that I sent, when I queried most recently, I didn't bother personalizing unless I had a really good reason to, like something like I mentioned, and it really didn't make any difference in request rates. So save yourself a lot of time.
I'll just add in also, if you are going to submit directly to small publishers, or if somebody asks for a full request, please add in your word count, because agents and editors have an overflowing inbox, and the word count is how we allocate our time. If I have something that comes through that doesn't have a word count, it goes to the bottom. So because I will mark out what I can do that evening or that day, or if I allocate one day a week to dedicated reading, I know I can get through, say, 10 or 12 manuscripts in a day, depending on the word count. If there's several novellas that come through, because some of my imprints will take novellas, I can get through a stack of those in a day, and I will line them up one after another. So please add in your word count, please, please, please.
I think for me, I would say the most important, I've also edited a bunch of query letters. And I think that what I find the common mistakes that I find, the first one is that I would say just keep it as concise and short as possible. Because a lot of the query letters that I've read tend to be too long and tend to have a lot of extraneous detail. It's really hard because you're taking an 80,000-90,000 word manuscript and you're putting it into like 150 words, and that's really hard. So I think really just focus on the four basic elements that I think a lot of people tell you about, which is who is it and what do they want, what's going to stop them, and what's at stake. And I think if you answered those questions in like a single sentence and stitch the query letter together, you'll be able to cut out a lot of your extraneous mistakes, because it's impossible to take something that's like 100,000 words and then put it into 150. So it's better to build out. And the other thing is voice. Always try to show your voice in your query. That really changed a lot of the things for me in terms of getting requests personally. And it also helped when I edited other people's query letters. That was something that I think really helped them, is to make sure that you write your query letter with the similar kind of voice that you write your book. I'd say that really changes everything. Yeah.
Short bit as someone who wrote a more quiet project. So I feel like a lot of folks who do write quieter manuscripts struggle with pitches because they end up being leaning very action oriented and high stakes oriented. And so if you're in that camp, definitely look up maybe literary queries that exist online. And I found for myself that what usually is the focus is the emotional stakes for the characters. So in response to what Marina said, and being more specific and not vague, being really specific with the emotions and what's at stake there and the conflicts. And it may seem really silly because it's between like two people and not a kingdom going to ruin, right? But that's what you have to really focus on if you do have like a quieter project that doesn't translate to being pitched super well.
Yeah, thanks for adding that in too. I think it's good to have a diverse sort of perspective on all the different kinds of books and projects. And as someone who had a quieter project too, that was something I struggled with quite a lot. And moving on to, I guess this is sort of a similar question, but in terms of opening chapters, which oftentimes we're adding with our queries, what do you recommend adding or making sure your opening chapters include in order to catch an agent's interest? And how can you make those opening chapters shine and make someone want to read more?
I can go first. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think the most important thing to do is to get objective external feedback and get a lot of objective external feedback and be prepared, because your opening, the first draft of your opening is going to be miles from the one that gets you an agent. Like, just be prepared, because it's going to take a lot of editing. No one, barely any manuscript I've read starts in the right place. And it's going to require a ton of like tightening, rewriting. And I think just getting as many beta readers and critique partners to go through that opening chapter as possible will help your manuscript. And I think another thing is to start with the character. They're in their normal world, but they have to be doing something within that normal world, because the opening chapter has to sort of give us a snapshot of what the character is doing before the story starts. And it has to be something that isn't everyday mundane, because your character's life isn't mundane even before the story starts. So your character has to be active and making choices from page one. As far like I'm not sure exactly this is true for literary fiction. I'm only speaking for the genre that I write, which is young adult, the age group and genre that I write, which is young adult and fantasy. And I think making sure that your protagonist is active and pursuing something, not the ultimate goal of the book, but something. I think that's really important, and will really is something that really makes your story shine. Yeah.
I'll pop in to say, as someone who queried with the prologue, I do see a lot of questions on prologues and like, should I include it? And my advice is, if you can cut the prologue to send to an agent, then the prologue should be cut altogether. What you shouldn't do is cut it for the agent and then include it in later in the full manuscript. That's a little odd, and it doesn't quite paint an accurate picture of how the book starts. So if you're in that camp, really think about it. I know a lot of us are married to our words, but very rarely, I think, do you need a prologue. And I know that's very common for like speculative, because I write in that genre. But again, if you can cut it, then you should just cut it completely, right? Versus doing that. And I will say, I think, when we think of active, to like expand what you envision what that word means, because I think people can sometimes simplify it, but even in a really oppressive society, when the character can't even do anything, they're still making choices. They might be really small or like choices for survival, but to kind of reframe how you think of that, and that will really help kind of do what was mentioned, right? Which is to write a really compelling beginning to your story.
I would say make it as clean as you possibly can. Make it so that you can read into that very first section and read through very cleanly and smoothly. A lot of what I see is very jerky in the front, and my best advice would be your first 5 chapters are probably going to be the hardest ones that you'll rewrite. A lot of authors, especially on their first book, find their voice about chapter 6 or so, and the voice flows really well. The story flows really smoothly from there on through. Those first 5 chapters often take a lot of rewriting, and the beaters are fantastic for that, or a critique partner who also writes and has published previously in your genre is really important, because 2 people who haven't published before can really get lost in trendy advice that's out there, and some of it may not be as useful as you hope it is. Also, make sure it's your voice, not somebody else's voice that is in that work, because if that voice changes halfway through, again, it's not something that represents the work that you want out there. A lot of the time I see on social media, this isn't the debut that I wanted. So make sure it is your voice and your work that you really, really want represented in that first chapter, because that's what the agent or the editor is reading the first time that they see you, and that's what's representing you on the page. Avoid info dumps. This is my favourite thing to talk about. Work your information in through the character's internals or dialogue. Please don't whack down lots and lots of chunky bricks of information. We love your story. We love your world building. We love everything about your character. We want to see it woven through like a beautiful tapestry. We want it to flow and not affect your pacing, and how the reader is going to read through that story. It doesn't have to be a page turner. It doesn't have to be the fastest book ever read, but it does need to be something that is beautiful and woven beautifully, not something that's going to chunk us up on page 3 where the reader is going to put the book down and never pick it up again. So read it through with a reader's eyes, not an author's eyes when you read it through. We know it's your book, baby. We know it is beautiful. Polish it beautifully first.
Yeah, I think to add on to that a little bit, when people say to start with something happening, I think that especially for a fantasy, authors often go like too far in the other direction where it's like a crash, bang, boom fight. So I think like the main things that I really like to see in a first chapter are like a small change happening. So like something that's like starting the tipping point of the story, but isn't necessarily like life or death. Some sort of surprise. Like if everything goes exactly how the main character expects it to go, then it's not very interesting for the reader either. And I think like it's really great to get the reader invested in your character. So a good way to do that is to give your character something that they really want in the first chapter, especially if they can't have it.
Yeah. Thank you, all of you. I think now it would be a good time to maybe move away from the writing itself and go on to sort of more of the strategy. So we had a lot of questions actually about how we can vet literary agencies. Obviously, there are a lot out there. You know, there are a lot of big players and smaller players. How do you gauge an agency's reputation and track record with both authors and sales? And then we had someone also ask, how do you approach vetting agencies or agencies who have a limited online presence? Maybe that's like an old website, or they're not posting on Instagram or Twitter. So yeah, I'll end the question there.
Publishers Marketplace is your best friend. It will show you their sales history. So even if there's somebody who's a new agency, if they have previously published a traditional book, it will be listed there, or a bigger sale will be listed there. If you look up my name, for example, I've got a couple of things that have listed up there. That is not everything that I have acquired for Evernight. Last year I acquired 68 books. There's 3 listed. So it doesn't actually show everything. It is only reported deals, and it's only specific larger reported deals. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a bigger advance. It's just what we considered as a business, our larger books for that year. It doesn't report my other 5 pen names or the 163 books that I have out. What you can do then is go back through, say, Amazon, biggest search engine in the world. It is your absolute best friend for looking up comps, for looking up authors and their sales history, because you can look at those rankings and it will show you their history. You look at that ranking, the overall ranking in the store. It is an hourly updated ranking. So what you're seeing is whether or not it has sold a book recently. So if it's in the millions, it hasn't sold a book recently, and probably not in the last couple of months. You can look at both the ebook and at the paperback. The paperback might not move as often. The ebook is a really good example of whether or not the books are moving, and whether or not either the publisher or the author is active in marketing their work. And some authors may have a favourite book that they always push. I certainly do. I know that it brings through readers through to different series and different books. So have a look through their backlist. Have a look through who is publishing that work. In that, there's a little metadata section as well. It shows who published that book. You can then go onto their website and correlate. So have a look and check through that through Publishers Marketplace. You're going to get a really good gauge of what and how legitimate this publisher or agent is in their workplace, whether or not they're a legitimate person, whether or not it looks scammy. There is a lot of very scammy profiles out there at the moment. There's been a couple of famous authors who have contacted me and said, "Hi, how are you going? I'd love to talk about books," on Twitter or X recently. They're very scammy profiles. These people don't have time to talk to me. They're multi-million-dollar authors. They do not have time to talk to me. Okay. A lot of them are listed on Writers Beware, run by Victoria Strauss. This is another excellent resource. Please go check it. There is a whole agency scamming website tab on there at the moment that she's put up. So please go check that as well. So there's Publishers Marketplace, Amazon, and Writers Beware are some of your best resources for this.
Yeah, adding on to that, Writers Beware is a really great resource. And another resource you want to keep in mind is called Absolute Writers, essentially. And sometimes when you want to look up like an agency, if you Google Absolute Writers and then the name of the literary agency you want to research, like sometimes they'll have like community forum threads of people, asking about the agency. And sometimes these threads do go on for like literal years. You can also look back into past history as well too. As Sophia also stated, Publishers Marketplace, I think it's a really great starting point, and I think they still have this, so you don't necessarily have to pay because it's like a $25 membership fee per month, which is kind of pricey. But I do think they have like a short-term membership, which it may be like equivalent of basically like a day pass, essentially. We can have it for 24 hours. And I think that's only a one-time fee. So if you get that, you can use it and you can like look up all the agents that you want. But as she also said, I'm thinking for the fact, for example, my literary agent, if you look at her Publishers Marketplace history, it looks like she like didn't sell anything for like an entire year, when the reality was like she had to sit on like I think 5 or 6 book deals that went unannounced for various reasons for like an entire year. And also the thing with Publishers Marketplaces, like certain types of deals were kind of like won't have that type of announcement. For example, if it's like a book that's like an IP deal. So if you're working for sometimes for like a brand or something, like a gaming brand or something, or like a TV show, like they don't necessarily have those marketplace deals on the website. And typically if it's like a 2-book deal, or if it was a book that's sold as a trilogy, like you'll have the announcement for that first deal, but typically those second and third book deals, like they don't always get additional announcements. So those are some of the things you want to keep in mind as well too.
I was going to add for Publisher Marketplace, I've always been in a Discord where I could just ask, hey, does anybody have an active subscription and can look this up for me? So don't feel shy about asking that of your communities. And then to add, for those agents that are not online or don't have a very, very big online presence, this is probably more common again with literary agents. I know a few, for example, BitTon Wins agent does like a handshake agreement and is like not really on the internet. I would look up their name and see if they're attached to writers' profiles or listed on their websites, right? You can go into Google Books and search their name, and usually that will pop up if they said like, oh, thank you to my agent, blah, 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 for helping me shepherd this book. So there's other ways to try to find the sales they've done, even if it isn't like in Publish Marketplace or any other online directory.
I think also just to add one more resource, because these are all so valuable, but just one more resource to add is probably Query Tracker itself. It has a ton of information about which agents are active, what their response time is, which is actually gold. How many queries they've gotten lately, how many they've responded to lately, things like that. Even let people leave comments about their experiences as well, which I mean, I recommend you read through if as well when you're querying, and I really think I think largely I don't remember finding any agencies that were shady on Query Tracker throughout my entire time in the trenches. So I think it's pretty reliable already, but just like one more resource that I think really helps.
I think I'll add on just one thing, that no one's mentioned yet, which is you can also just ask around. A lot of the information about like who is, a bad agent, or, not necessarily red flags, but like maybe not an agent with a good working style for you. A lot of that sort of thing is floated around in whisper networks, which are a lot easier to access after you are agented, which is not ideal. But what I did when I was querying was I asked a lot of mentorships, Because like I would just contact some people who are mentors because they're usually pretty open to that sort of thing and be like, hey, do you know anything about this agent? Would you be willing to like look over my query list for me? That sort of thing. And then like if you ask around in servers like the round table server, like a lot of people generally have knowledge too.
Yeah. Thank you guys. So I'm gonna move on to the next question now. Again, very different topic, but I think super relevant even after you get an agent, even after you sell your first book. How do you handle rejections? How do you stay motivated while dealing with rejections? And what advice would you give to others? Maybe specifically people who are querying right now and not seeing the results they want or are about to start querying and are nervous to enter the trenches.
One of the things I probably should have done, but I didn't because I didn't have enough foresight, was I had some friends basically set up a separate email inbox for querying, and I think that was helpful on their end because for me, I just use my regular emails. So sometimes I had query rejections kind of coming in at all times of the hours during the day. And so, yeah, there were times I just opened my email at like 10 p.m. at night. I'm like, oh, look, another query rejection. And then I would feel a little sad about that. But I think for the sake of your own sanity, that can be like a very helpful strategy because you kind of have that type of your life kind of like cordoned away essentially. And so yeah, that would be one strategy I would recommend, which I think could be helpful for some people.
I feel like this is a really personal and subjective question because it depends on how each person kind of reacts to rejection. So some of the various things that I've seen people do that they feel was helpful and protect their mental health because it's really rough, especially now. I think some people like to collect like buttons for every rejection just to kind of like tell themselves they're going to get 100 rejections this year. That was something some people did. Some people tried manifesting. Some people, like what I did was I ignored it completely and tried to forget it as soon as possible. And I don't remember how many rejections I have, and I don't remember what they said, unless it was really good or really bad. Apart from that, I just like that was for my mental health, which I've never seen anyone else do. Like everyone else seems to be like dealing with it in a completely different way. But what worked for me was to just not engage, just like move on to the next query. It just felt like the only thing to do because you just have to remind yourself that I think it's something that I think everyone gets told that like the people who don't give up are the ones who make it. So you just have to remember that it's just you just need one yes, and it could be right around the corner. So yeah.
Jump in as the, oh no, you can't see. Yeah, this was my 2022 rejection tracker. So I was the person who like literally gave myself stars for every 10, and then every 10 I would get myself a treat. And there was no definition. So sometimes it was small, sometimes it was bigger, a lot of times it was a book. So I'm very like reward driven. I need sweet treats to like keep me sane. So to echo what Vishaka said, do what makes you feel right. Because I think some people need to kind of separate themselves, like she mentioned. And I do know like I'm someone who kind of just needs to wallow. Like if I just feel yeah, I'm in my feelings about it, I just need to let myself feel like really negative and really bad about it for like a day and then move on. So whatever feels right to you, I guess, don't feel guilty that you're not like coping with it the same way someone else is. Because I think so much of publishing is already a comparison game that your feelings should also not be part of that. And that's what kind of kept me grounded when and all of it's so subjective, right? And it feels personal, it does. And I had to remind myself, like, this is not personal, like, this is not about me, even though it feels like it is.
Yeah, thank you. And I think like something we're all learning as in this mentorship program too is like being on the other side and reading submissions, and it is just so subjective, and that's something I didn't like really believe before, I think, doing this for the first time, but now I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. I do get what agents have to, go through, and yeah, it's a very tricky process, and it is just really not personal at all, which is comforting too. To kind of understand. And so this is kind of similar vein. Is there anything you wish you had done differently during your querying journey? maybe some insight that you wish you could tell your querying self, anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, I actually completely forgot I did this when I mentioned this earlier, but and there's a reason why this piece of advice is said. But back when I was in my second trenches for the second time in the career trenches, I actually created two different manuscripts at the same time. I would not recommend that in retrospect. It luckily ended up being okay. And one thing I did was at least like they were in different categories. So I created an adult women's fiction novel, and then I created a contemporary YA because I pitched both of them doing DB Pit and Pitman. And I think honestly, I just had a moment of panic. I was like, oh, what if nobody ever wants to represent me again? So was kind of like throwing both off into the board. But like the general, I feel like piece of advice I've heard, it's like why you should generally avoid that is it can cause some complications like down the line, and especially like particularly you also shouldn't be querying two different manuscripts, especially in the same category, because in my case, I did try to be like a little strategic in which I did mostly try to query agents who represented both categories, but it could be a case in which like you are representing um you are querying an agent who may, represent adult fiction, but they don't perhaps like you didn't take a look too closely at their submission guidelines and you didn't see that they don't represent YA fiction. So that kind of creates an immediate problem in itself if you get an offer for like one manuscript in like one age group, but they don't represent the other manuscript. And so it can cause some complications. So in general, the idea is that you really want to be like putting your like best work out there and like querying one manuscript at a time. It did work out for me, but it was a very short time period. And in retrospect, I probably wouldn't have done that. So yeah.
Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I can share. So I guess this isn't really something I like regret exactly because I figured it out eventually. But one thing I definitely wasn't thinking about when I started querying was thinking of it as a career rather than individual books. So like generally when you debut, the publisher will want you to have like 2 to 3 more manuscripts in that same sort of vein because they want to like pitch you as a brand, right? So it makes them easier to promote your books. So one thing that I wish I'd thought about sooner was like, what did I want like the sort of book that I published to be versus like, here's the book that I finished and it's ready to query. Especially because I'm the sort of writer who has a lot of ideas. So like prioritizing the ones that like feel more like you is yeah, just something to think about when you start querying. Like, what do you want your career to look like instead of just like, is this book ready to query, basically.
My thing kind of adds on to what Eunice was saying, which is she was talking about querying 2 projects simultaneously. I did that too, but I also edited 2 projects simultaneously, which I don't recommend while I was querying. So I was like, and I think that energy wise, that wasn't smart of me in terms of like taking care of my energy, and that wasn't smart of me in terms of just the timeline, because I would be kind of going from one book to another, and both of them were taking longer to complete. So I would recommend sticking with one project and querying that project. And that's definitely my big one. Yeah.
One small thing that is not necessarily a mistake, but I think a lot of writers that I know and my friends can get stuck in is that community is really good. It's amazing. It's great to be in community and to find folks. At the same time, if you're in a group where people are just very anxious and there's still a lot of kind of negative feelings around querying, which is totally valid, right? That's 1000% valid. But if you find it affecting you, because I'm someone who's like, oh, it affects me, but I feel guilty almost. Like I owe my friends to be present and to be around. That's not the case. That if you need to remove yourself and go take a walk and not kind of feel and absorb other people's anxiety, then do that. Support networks are there and they should support you. And if they're not doing that, then you kind of have to recalibrate your relationship.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing that. I think we'll jump to the last sort of guided question just to make sure we have enough time for the questions that came in. And the ones from the Discord. How can writers position themselves for success beyond the querying process, such as building an author platform or engaging with the writing community? Do you guys think that social media is necessary? Is there sort of, maybe for someone who isn't as comfortable with social media, what would you recommend for them? What do you feel is necessary, I guess, when you're querying and beyond, I think, too, as an author on sub or a published author?
So I'd say that your toolbox needs to be the social media that you are most comfortable with. Eventually, you're probably going to end up trying quite a few platforms and looking at whatever is coming out new as your books come out, because your publisher or you are going to find that you want to be on there. You're going to try and push your books on there and see what happens. I remember when TikTok first came out, I was desperate to get on there and try and sell my books. It didn't work out. My audience is much older. I stuck with Instagram. It works for me, and Facebook. Now Facebook isn't doing so great, so I will try some new things that come out. But you will want a newsletter. Whether or not it's now or later, a newsletter is something that you probably will want over time, because it is one thing that, unlike social media, you don't own the presence. A newsletter is something that you do own. So nobody can take it away from you as long as you back it up. Please do back up your newsletter subscriptions. We can talk about it somewhere else, because this is an enormous topic that can go a long, long way. And I'm sure we're going to run out of time if I start blathering on. But it is something that you can absolutely research. Also, you can also message me, and I will talk your ear off about this all day. But a newsletter is something that you can absolutely reach your audience on there, and have your audience come and talk to you like they are literally in the room with you, which is a great thing, because social media is just such a wide scatter. Even if you are aiming at a demographic that you think is your audience, a newsletter is a person-to-person type of relationship, and it's a way to build super fans who will come back and buy and read your books each time, which is a really, really great thing. So that would be my best advice.
I think just to add on to that, for social media, it makes a big difference whether you are a nonfiction writer or a fiction writer. So for fiction writers, social media doesn't really matter as much. Like I've generally heard that it's considered a bonus if you have a good social media following, but it's not a requirement. The bare minimum that's generally recommended is having an author website. But for nonfiction, it makes a huge difference if you have a platform and a big following. So those are completely separate markets.
Yeah, and do you guys have any advice too for people who are looking for writing communities? Especially since writing can feel like such a solitary endeavor. How do you guys recommend people make connections, whether that's online or maybe in person? Did you have any strategies that you guys used or ways that you were able to find people?
I think for me, a lot of my contacts, a lot of my writerly friends came through pitch parties and engaging in like comments and that kind of thing. And then that sometimes leads to meeting someone who's part of a Twitter group or a Discord group, and kind of just being kind of active there, just being friendly, talking to people, listening, and kind of reaching out and asking to see if anyone's like, just like naturally how relationships go. Asking if they're willing to critique, or if you're willing to. Also, following authors that you think, or writers who you think are interesting or cool. And again, pitch parties are great for that, because you can literally see the kinds of, whether they're writing in your genre, which is a good thing to think about if you're looking for beta readers, or critique partners, or just friends. And just sort of being active, and just, I think that was one. And another one is like part of mentorship programs. I think that if you start to engage, often they'll have some kind of Discord chat, or they'll have a server or something, and you'll be able to meet other prospective applicants, which I think really helps. Whether or not you get the mentorship, you might not need it, you might need it, you might get it, but you'll be able to meet other people who are in the same place as you. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to add for in person, if you don't live in a big city, and even if you do, because big cities, I think, just more commonly have writers groups. I think good places to look for those is your local library system, because they'll have like events and people will rent out the room for like monthly writing group meetings. I would follow. I find it depends on social media, but a lot of arts organizations are commonly popular on Instagram. So just looking up local arts organizations, their pages, see if they're posting about writers or other kind of creative groups meeting up. Because I know in person is a little bit harder in my experience. But you can find the communities there. And if you do happen to get into a writers group that you vibe with, it can be really just nice to have people to see face to face. And often, at least for me, it's nice to have folks who are not in like trad pub trenches, right? Who are like poets or like do other arts things. So it's kind of nice to nurture their creative spirit. I know that sounds like really like crunchy, but you know, like sometimes I feel really bad about my writing and I just need to be like creative with someone who's like not stressing about trad pub. So that's been helpful too.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with that. So, okay, awesome. I think we should move on to questions that we've received from Discord or Twitter. And if we don't get to your question, feel free to just chat in the Discord group or tweet any of us or whatever. We won't have time for every question, but and we're just going to try to get to the ones that might apply to the most people. But for any specifics, just reach out. So we got a question on querying a series. Should you mention the number of books you're planning? Should you have outlines for sequels prepared, or do agents only want to talk about one book? I'm just going to tack another question on too for querying multiple POVs, which I feel like this question is pretty relevant for any like sci-fi fantasy books. Do you need to include all POVs in your query? Basically, yeah. Are you mentioning sequels in your query? Or are you mentioning all the POVs in your query?
I can tackle the POV one. So it depends on how many points of view and how they're balanced. So generally, if it's a dual point of view book where it's about 50-50, you want to mention both of the points of view in the query. So like a good structure is like your first plot paragraph would be about the first point of view character, second plot paragraph is about the second one, and then your third plot paragraph ties them together. If you have more than 2 points of view characters, then generally you want to pick one and write the query from their point of view. And usually you want that to be the same point of view that starts the book so that the agent doesn't read your query and then go like, who is this other person?
So I can actually just quickly answer too for series. I've heard just that it's best to, especially if you're debuting, to make sure that you can sell the book as a standalone, that it has kind of a plot line that finishes in a clean way so that it's not too much of a cliffhanger, just in case, because I think what I've heard is that series are becoming harder and harder to sell, especially as a debut. And so if you want to poise yourself for an agent and for a deal, that, you know, as much as it would be great to write a series, to plan for the worst case scenario, which is potentially a standalone, right now is the most strategic thing to do. So as for the next question, and this was something I wondered a lot when I was a querying author, is there a best time of year to query? And then adding on to that too, is it good to prioritize fast responders first? Do you recommend doing smaller batches or just kind of sending them all out? I know the advice has kind of changed a little bit over the years too. So would love to hear any of your thoughts on that.
I would say the best time of year to query is when your manuscript is at its most polished, honestly. Don't rush it. Please don't rush it. If that manuscript, at the moment, agents are taking anywhere between 3 to 6 months to get back to you. There are some fast responders out there who are always going to be fast and they're on top of their inbox, and that's fantastic, but there are a lot. In my last batch, I closed off a manuscript at 120 days with an offer, and over 70% never got back to me. So there is a lot of ghosting going on out there. When I looked back on Query Tracker, most of them weren't caught up to that point. So it some weren't responding at all, and some, I think, just weren't caught up to that point. So there is no rush, is what I'm saying. So please just don't worry about the time of year, because the day that you send it on isn't going to influence the day they read it on. So you just make sure that manuscript is in the best condition it can possibly be, because that's what they're going to read. Don't send it and then have buyer's remorse and try and take it back. Okay. As far as which, what was our next question? I'd had that written down. I had our second question written down. Olivia, what was our next question?
It was best home view to query, fast responders, and I think that was it. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, that was it. I'm done. I'm good. I'm done.
Something that also came to mind, which I hadn't really thought of, was also be aware, because this is also a consequence of post-pandemic querying, but you also have some agents also closing to queries for longer periods of time too, because that was also a thing too, like pre-pandemic, in which like agents might like close their queries for like maybe like once in a blue moon, but they're also closing for longer periods of time, in which it may be, you know, like 6 months, possibly like a year or longer. So I feel like most agents are pretty up to date, and like they'll announce on social media, whether it's, I think, typically on Twitter, or it'll also be like listed in those submission guidelines, you know, like X agent is like closed to queries. So keep that in mind. And just off the top of my head, like maybe like the last 2 weeks of the year, basically from like the last 2 weeks of December, is just when most of the literary agencies like do close down for the holidays. So it's like if you send a query, like they're probably still gonna get it. It's just gonna be like in a queue and so on. But off the top of my head, that's really the only time of the year which the entire industry like consistently shuts down each year for the Christmas holidays, essentially.
I will also say for tying with holidays, though, again, it's like some might take that opportunity to read. So to Sophia's point, it's like just send it when you're ready and don't rush or delay. But I think Eunice's point is really important, because some folks might be closed. So pay attention if you really have like a dream agent who you really, really want to query. I will say for fast responders, to only query fast responders if you actually do want to work with them. Because I know a lot of people use them as like a pulse check, like, is my query package working? And I feel like in the current climate, that is maybe less accurate. And so I would hate for someone to have queried someone just for a fast response and then actually not want to work with them if they do get an offer. So keep that in mind. And I believe there was an additional question alluded onto that with like batches. And I will say, like, it used to be query in batches, then you'll get responses and some feedback and you can change things. Very, very rarely will you get actual actionable feedback now from agents. That said, though, I queried in batches just for my own sanity, right? So I could just send 5, take a little break, get an ice cream, come back to it later. And then in the event you do want to potentially revise, not that you expecting that you may not get any actionable feedback, but if you still want that option, then you should batch query, because if you exhaust your lists, then you don't really have an option to go back and revise. So that's just something to keep in mind. But again, that's really for yourself. Don't rely on getting feedback necessarily.
I'm just going to complicate that a bit. Feedback can vary and be completely, is often subjective and can be really misleading, and not all about, there might be a problem, it might not be the problem in the query, or there might not be a problem, it might just be that particular agent thinks that this isn't right for them. They might not like this type of story. And even if you send out, say, 5 or 10 queries, that doesn't really tell you anything. And if you're collecting data, you should probably, like, I queried in small batches, but I don't recommend it, because I honestly think if you feel like your query ready and your betas have told you your query ready, then slightly bigger batches if you want to do batches. But whenever you do get feedback, always try to, there's a cat, always try to process it and see if there's any kind of overlap as well, because feedback can be wrong a lot of the time, and it might not align with your vision, which is fine, because you might really still just find an agent with whom it aligns. Yeah.
Yeah, adding to that, it could be because I dealt with this in the career trenches where I would get like career rejections for something and like an agent would say, oh, like this part of like the story like didn't work for me. And then I'd get like a positive response from another agent being, well, I love this aspect of this story. So really the only time I kind of paid attention to like conflicting feedback is when if there was like a noticeable pattern in the feedback, if it's like, okay, if like a number of agents are saying this, like this is something perhaps I should pay attention to or consider. But once again, like it's really so subjective in the industry and so on. So it could be a case in which that particular agent was just not a particular fit for your book and so on.
Yeah, thank you for that. We also got a question about that we haven't really touched on yet. Is it a bad idea to mention if the writer is not from the US in the bio part of the query? The question was, should I avoid that part since some agents might not want to work with international clients? Do you think that makes a difference?
Flat
I'm
out,
not just,
no.
oh,
Don't worry
sorry.
about it.
Yeah, I can also add on to this. My agent is in the UK and I'm in the US. I think it's super common for international like people to work together, especially with everything being online. It's really not an issue.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was in India and I was getting requests, and then I was in Vancouver and I got my agent. So it's all it's
Yeah,
fine.
that's perfect. Yeah.
yeah, I was just gonna add if an agency like doesn't want to work in international orders, I'm sorry, they're a bunch of weirdos. Like I they're just a bunch of weirdos in my opinion. And so because yeah, because really that really only I feel like that aspect if you're international based, like that really comes just kind of later on in which like a little agent will help in terms of like taxation purposes to make sure you're not being like double taxed. But like yeah, it really shouldn't be an issue. And I if anything, I think that could be a point of interest for an agent if you mention that like in your bio, they're like, oh yeah, that's cool. Like learning that you're from like a different country. So definitely yeah, for you to add that. Like you don't necessarily have to if you're not like comfortable, but I think this like goes back to a personalization, like when you're adding stuff with your bio, like that's like something cool to put on there. So yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I will say if you are querying between the two kind of major markets, which are the US and the UK, and have an agent in the whatever territory and you're in the other one, you'll just their royalty, not royalty, their percentage that they take as an agent will differ depending if you're in the same kind of country as them. So if that matters to you, and you're US based, then maybe just query US agents and vice versa if the UK, but isn't like a huge difference. It's just something to consider.
Also, I just thought of this now. For in terms of careering, also keep in mind because I had totally forgotten about this, but some of the larger agencies, for example, like Curtis Brown, they also have like a UK arm and like a US arm for little agencies. So just double check in terms of their submission guidelines and what the submission policies are, because some of these little agencies do have a US arm and they may have a UK arm.
And for anyone wondering about the percentage difference, usually for if they're in the same country, like if you had a US agent selling to the US, they would take 15% commission, and if they sold to like the UK, it would be 20% commission. So it's not a huge difference.
Yeah, so the next question too, I wanted to, because I don't think we've talked too much about comps yet, which are obviously very important and also very confusing. So the person asked hooky comps or realistic comps. By hooky, they mean books like Six of Crows, Peaky Blinders. By realistic, they mean more books of the same caliber as yours, fresh debuts in the same genre, maybe non-bestsellers, but from the last 2 to 3 years. Do you guys have a preference? Do you think writers should prioritize one or the other?
I have thoughts. I think all your comps should probably be within the past 5 years maximum, preferably 2 to 3 years. Always, it just shows the agent that you know the market. And I think go for whatever comps are truest to the elements and the tone and the vibe of your book, rather than and also I would say stick to books, but I've seen it work. I've seen people choose movies or choose TV shows and I've seen it work, but I would recommend largely stick to books. It's just good to follow the rules because, I mean, because it's not a good idea to take a chance that you might be an outlier unless you're really confident. But yeah, I would say books last 2 to 3 years. It can be bestseller if it's true to your book. Like, just don't oversell or undersell your book in any way. Don't you have to sell yourself, so don't undersell, and don't promise more than your book can deliver because that will probably turn agent off. Yeah.
To the point about comps that are movies and films and stuff, it's a little confusing because I think querying writers will see like, well, editors and agents will use big comps. Or I'll open a book and it's like The Hunger Games meets The Matrix, right? They're allowed to do that. It's really weird, but basically editors and agents can pitch books however they want to, and the querying writer though is constrained by a little bit more. And like Michelle just said, it's about knowing, demonstrating your market and what you're writing for. I will say if something that is not a book, it's just like really truly a perfect comp, right? That like someone who watches that show will absolutely love your book. Go ahead and use it, but have at least one book that's like in your age range, in your genre, to demonstrate you have that knowledge. Because if it's both films or both things that are not books, that may be a little bit more concerning for a query letter. So just have at least one. But yeah, it's so confusing because I remember looking at it and being like, wait a minute, like editors and agents do this all the time. The rules are different, and that's something you learn after you get into the industry.
I
Yes.
think sorry.
Yeah.
We might have, oh, sorry. We actually might have gotten a related question about using comps that are like too new. So a comp I think would be considered too new is if you're perhaps a writer, you got your hands on like an advanced reader's copy or like a galley copy of a book that hasn't even published yet, that's probably a little too new. In the same way, if you want to use like a TV show comp or like a film comp for like a movie that's like not out yet, like that's probably too new. So yeah, I would not recommend using comps for books that have not even published yet to the general public. So yeah.
I actually wanted to add a quick question that I've seen in a few places, but specifically for writers of color too, who might have a hard time finding comps that, from writers of the same identity, just because of how publishing works. Do you guys have any like sort of recommendations or advice for those writers who aren't able to find exact matches as other people might be able to? And how do you recommend working around that?
This is hard, but I'm just gonna take a stab at this. I was lucky because I think I did find some, diverse books, because there's like a flood of diverse books, or there has been more or less like quite a few diverse novels recently. I One thing that this reminds me of though is I don't remember what book it was, but it's pitched as Harry Potter going to a black university, like a historically black college. And I was thinking that's a really clever way to pitch your book because you don't have a comp, but you're kind of giving us context for how your book is diverse, along with giving us a comp that is recognizable. And I wouldn't recommend going Harry Potter, but it worked for this author, but I wouldn't recommend it. And I think trying to find a story that is similar to yours in vibe or theme or that kind of thing, because that will be there. The experience will not be there, but the theme and the conflict or the character, the journey will be there, or the vibe will be there. So that's what I recommend.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry for putting you on the spot. So yeah, I think we have time for maybe one or two more. One of the ones that I liked was so approaching querying with a manuscript after you've done revisions. So what do you guys recommend for that? Can you query agents again for the same manuscript if you previously received a rejection from them, or maybe a pass of a full or a partial, or maybe they have your full or partial right now? What do you recommend?
Well, I'll say I don't have experience doing this, but after having talked to multiple folks, the idea is if you've done a substantial revision and you judge it to be substantial, go ahead and query again. I think most agents and editors I've seen who have addressed this have said, yeah, like don't self-reject. Like if you think it's substantial, go ahead and send it to me. And if they still don't like it or they don't think it's substantial enough, like they'll pass again. So don't kind of self-select out. And I know there's some feeling, oh, what if I get blacklisted? What if some agents like you disregarded my rules and I'm gonna like, you probably don't want to work with them. I've heard it happen like 1 out of 1 million times, and that person is just like a difficult person to work with. Quite honestly, I've read interviews where agents are like, yeah, after a couple of months, like I'm gonna probably forget, so I'm not gonna exactly remember most of the time. So go ahead and query, and that's also true of like the one no from one is a no from all agencies where they're like, yeah, like we have those guidelines, try to follow them. But again, if you query like a day or a week before the time frame, like no one's really gonna like keep super track of that and ding you on it. So
I will say with Query Tracker, agents who use Query Tracker, including at the same agency, can see if you have queried them before or have queried somebody else at their agency. So if they're a no from one is no from all agency, then they will see if you've queried before. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, you're not going to get like blacklisted for it.
I feel that most literary agencies will have something in their submission guidelines, but generally most of them will be receptive to seeing the same manuscript as long as you've done substantial revisions. But I think typically like the general policy is you just have to make a note of it, like in the query that you've done a substantial revision.
And we also have a question from actually from someone who is asking live. Can you have multiple agents, like one that represents your fantasy work and one that only represents your contemporary work?
I could take this one. Yes, it depends, but yes. So when you sign with an agent, you're going to get an agency contract. Some of them are really limiting, like we want to represent everything you write. Some of them are we want to represent the specific book. Some of them are we want to represent all your, kidlit or all your adult. So it's going to depend on the agency, but there are definitely cases where people will have, sorry about the cat noise. There's definitely cases where people will have like one agent for kidlit and one agent for adult. It's less common to have a different agent for different genres, but that is sometimes possible as well.
Awesome. And then I think we can close it out with one last question, or maybe we can do one question, general thoughts. But so someone asked, how much wiggle room is there for word counts? And I'm gonna just broaden that to genres in general. Each genre has their own conventions. Each age group has their own conventions. How much do you guys recommend sticking to that? Is there any wiggle room for if your book or your voice or whatever, for some reason needs to break those conventions? What do you recommend?
I will say try to stick to convention as much as you can. I know it can kind of suck because you see authors break these rules all the time. That said, the rules for like Brandon Sanderson are different for a debut fantasy writer, and that's kind of just the truth of it. If you are like slightly off, I wouldn't sweat it too much. Plenty of books go through revision with agents and even more revision when they sell. That said, though, with the query tracker comment, if your book's a doorstopper, agents are able to set like, I'm going to auto reject after 150K. So just know that if you're in a range in which it's not unlikely for someone to have a set of rule like that, that you will preclude yourself from making the cut just because they have an automated rule set. So keep that in mind as well. I will say, with genre, fantasy, and sci-fi, you have more room to go longer. Other genres, you have much less. And it is a trend more and more now that shorter books are being prioritized. And I know people have a lot of feelings about that, but just even on a logistical level, it is cheaper to print a smaller book. So keep that in mind. I know it's kind of frustrating, but to give yourself the best chance, try to cut as much as you can.
Absolutely agree. We have for Evernight, we have a range of word limit from 20 to 100,000 words. If something comes through my inbox that is 150,000 words, it is an auto reject. I don't even read the query letter, it gets an auto reject. So please do read whatever the submission guidelines are for whoever you are submitting to. Please read them. It's across the board. It doesn't matter who you're submitting to. There are reasons for it. Whatever their reasons are, that's their audience. That's what they believe they can sell that book to, whether it's a publisher or an agent. And there was something else I was going to say, and I sound like my mum with dementia at the moment. I'm sorry, I've got it. It's coming through the line. Oh my gosh, what was the next thing I was going to say again? No, I'll think on it later. I'll put it in the chat later.
So I actually thought this word count question was actually for the query letter, but I think that also might be helpful to address because I think on average, like if your query letter is between, personally, mine was actually on like the longer side, but ended up being okay. But anywhere from being like maybe like 400 to 600 words. But I think the main important thing is if you can fit your query letter to 1 page single space, like that's really more the ideal target is what it is. But yeah, I feel like on average query letters, it can be typically anywhere from like 400 to like 600 words. I actually just looked mine up and I actually sent one in the trenches that was like a little over 600 words, but I didn't have any trouble getting requests. So I managed to fit everything under 1 page to 1 page. So yeah, just I think the more important thing is making sure everything can fit on 1 page single space is the important thing with the query letter and how many words it should be.
All right. Well, I think, yeah, thanks for answering all those questions. And while we're closing out, do you guys have any last thoughts or any words of encouragement that you want to give to querying writers? It's such a horrible process. A lot of good can come out of it, but most of the time it can be pretty soul crushing. So, you know, if there's anything you want to leave the audience with, now is the time.
Once they did kind of go off the soul crushing part, it's a really like hard process and never feel like you're uniquely experiencing it because you're not. And the upside is, and I know I'm speaking as someone who has the privilege of having kind of passed that first level of gatekeepers, but you know, I was raised by immigrants in the US. I went to college without knowing anything. When I was job applying, I felt very often, I'm like, oh, all these like accesses to networks and knowing things and having connections were so prohibitive to me. It was very clear. And despite all of its faults, I'm not claiming querying is a perfect meritocracy by any stretch of the imagination. So I hope no one reads it that way. But anybody can write a book and anybody can query. So it's one of the few instances where I didn't necessarily feel like I was completely blocked out because I didn't get that internship or I didn't know people from whatever, right? And so to try to, I guess, hang on to that as a positive thing, right? This is accessible. And even if there are a lot of things that can change to make it better, it is one of the processes I do feel like, you know, as someone who didn't get an MFA, I wasn't in English, like it felt really good to be in community and feel like my peers respect me as a writer, like regardless of my background. So that was something I took from the querying process and I felt good about even when I felt really bad about other things.
I think nearly everyone at every level suffers from some form of imposter syndrome at some point. And I made the choice actively today not to come on with a face full of makeup because I wanted to. I also am a stay-at-home mum as well as a full-time writer and acquisitions editor, and I chose to look like I have for the last 4 weeks of school holidays, and this is my average working outfit. I wanted to show that this is what I look like on a day-to-day basis. And as much as I also wanted to show a professional face, it's boiling hot here and my makeup was going to melt right off my face. I wanted to show that imposter syndrome is, look, and I felt uncomfortable about it the whole time. I really, really, really wanted that face of makeup on because it was my barrier between me and the world. Imposter syndrome with rejections. really, really stings. Imposter syndrome, putting your book out really stings. I just put out ARCs for my release on the 20th. That stung too. I'm starting to get some reviews back. Some of them are great. Some of them, you're not going to make everybody happy every time. It is with everybody at every single level. So if you feel it, you are not alone. And know that we are here. That's what the community is for. And inboxes are always open.
I would also recommend definitely allow yourself, if you're currying and with your currying journey, you're at a point where it's basically like having like a debilitating effect on your mental health. Because there are definitely times when I got career rejections, I'm like, wow, I never want to write again, essentially. And thankfully, those days weren't as much. But if it is getting to the point where it is like kind of debilitating and affecting like your day-to-day basis, you can definitely give yourself permission to take a break. And I think that can be helpful. That can be definitely helpful for you, like in the long term for your mental health and so on, because it's one thing to write for yourself, but writing for digital publication is an entirely different ballgame. And I feel like that's like an aspect that's not like entirely emphasized of that, but they are basically two entirely separate things. And sometimes I feel we're not as mentally prepared for that when we start careering, but yeah, it can be really tough. So definitely give yourself the permission to like take a break and so on, because like the little agents, they'll still be there basically, and so on when you come back. So yeah.
My advice is not about querying exactly, but like just focus on making sure your book is strong in its craft elements and making sure that you practice and you hone your craft, because once your book is solid, the offers will start coming in. I remember the moment I looked at my book and thought, this is ready, it's strong, I can't think of a single thing to change. And literally a month later, I got my offer, which was just wonderful because it was so clear to me at that point. So I honestly think that if you focus on honing your craft and just like go through the process, but like keep your focus on that, I think that it'll happen. It'll happen for you and it'll happen fast.
All right, yeah. I like we get to close out on that. So yeah, that's I think concludes our first panel. Thank you to all of you for being here and everyone who asked questions. Again, if we didn't answer your question, just feel free to chat in the Discord or email us or message or whatever. And yeah, we appreciate you and good luck querying to anyone who's watching. You can do it. And yeah, we'll end it here.